Okay, hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. In this lecture we're going to learn all about Kinesis. Now before we start on what Kinesis is, we should start to learn what streaming data is. And streaming data is data that is generated continuously by thousands of data sources, which typically send in the data records simultaneously and in small sizes. And we're talking about kilobytes here. So let's have a look at some examples of streaming data. So this could be purchases from an online store, such as Amazon.com. So every time you purchase a book or a Kindle or whatever, you get the transaction ID, you'll get the actual device description, you might get the unique ID for the individual item, etc., etc. And this is all just transactional data that is generated when you're purchasing something on an online store. Another example could just be stock prices. So it could be Tesla stock, or it could be stock in anything, Microsoft, Amazon, etc. And the stock prices move around all the time, and as soon as there's a change in the stock price, that is then streamed into something that needs to process it. We also have gaming data, so maybe it's someone playing Angry Birds, for example, where they're up to in a particular level and what particular puzzle they've just gone through and solved. Could be social network data. A really good example of this is Twitter. So it might be a particular hashtag, how many tweets are against it, how many retweets, how many comments, etc., etc. And then geospatial data. So think of things like Uber, for example. So when you're catching an Uber, where you are on a map is always streamed in to a server or a central source. So Uber can then go through and calculate the fastest way for you to get from your source to your destination. And it will take into account things like traffic, which it gets from other data sources as well. And then finally, we have IoT sensor data. So you could have an IoT garden, you could be a farmer using IoT devices across your farm, and all of this data is being streamed into a central source. So that's all streaming data is. It's data that's generated continuously by thousands of different sources, and typically this will be done simultaneously and in small sizes, and we're talking about kilobytes. So now that you know what streaming data is, well, what is Kinesis? So Kinesis is a platform on AWS to send your streaming data to. That's all it is. It's a place to send all your streaming data to. And Kinesis makes it easy to load and analyze streaming data, and also providing the ability for you to build your own custom applications for your business needs. And we have three different types of Kinesis. So we've got Kinesis Streams, we've got Kinesis Firehose, and we've got Kinesis Analytics. And for the exam, you are going to need to understand the three different types of Kinesis and what you should use where. So let's start with Kinesis Streams. Here we've got all our devices. So it could be our mobile phone using Uber. It could be our laptop tweeting something. It could be EC2 monitoring stock prices. It could be IoT. You might have a farm or something and you've got all this farming data coming in. So these are all your data producers. And what they do is they stream the data to Kinesis. And Kinesis Streams is a place to store that data. And by default, it's going to store that data for 24 hours. However, it can store it up to 7 days. So it's just a way of putting all that data, or a place to put all that data to. And your data is contained in shards. And we'll look at what a shard is in the next slide. But you might have a shard for different purposes. You might have a shard for your geospatial data. You might have a shard for your stock data. You might have a shard for your social media data. You might have a shard for your IoT data, etc. And the data is stored in shards, which EC2 instances, sometimes known as data consumers, can go in and analyze that data inside those shards. So you might be wanting to, be running an algorithm that predicts the stock market, or you might be doing sentiment analysis on Twitter on a particular hashtag. Do people feel good about this particular hashtag, or do people feel bad about a particular hashtag? You could be looking at, it could be Uber's servers, for example, calculating the best way for you to get to your destination. And then your EC2 instances, once they've analyzed this data and done something with it, they can then store it in a number of different places. So in DynamoDB, they could store it in S3, they could store it in EMR, they could store it in Redshift, they could store it basically in places where the EC2 instances could access. So RDS, for example. So that's all Kinesis Streams is. It allows you to persistently store your data for 24 hours to 7 days, while your data consumers go through and do something with that data. And then your data consumers, once they've analyzed that data, they stream might store the analytics somewhere in like DynamoDB or S3 or EMR or Redshift, etc. So that's all Kinesis Streams is. So Kinesis Streams consists of shards. Shards are basically 5 transactions per second for reads and up to a maximum total data read rate of 2 megabytes per second, and up to 1,000 records per second for writes, and up to a maximum total data write rate of 1 megabyte per second. So that's what an individual shard consists of. And then the data capacity of your stream is a function of the number of shards that you specify for a stream. And the total capacity of the stream is the sum of the capacities of its shards. Now, don't worry if that makes not a lot of sense. You're not going to be quizzed on any of this in the exam. The thing that you just have to remember is that shards are stored in Kinesis Streams. Kinesis Streams, your data, when you put your data into Kinesis Streams, it's all stored in individual shards. That's all you need to remember. So if you see shards come up in the exam, I want you to think straight away of Kinesis Streams, because Kinesis Streams is the only form of Kinesis that has shards. Kinesis Firehose, let's have a look at that. So we've got our data producers. So again, our EC2 instances, our smartphones, our laptops, our IoT, etc. And this is stored, or it's sent to Kinesis Firehose. Now, inside Kinesis Firehose, there's no persistent storage. The data has to be analyzed as it comes in. You have to do something with your data. So it's optional to have lambda functions inside your Kinesis Firehose. So as soon as the data comes in, it triggers a lambda function. Lambda function runs a particular set of code for that data and then outputs it somewhere safe. It could output it to S3, it could output it to Redshift. It can't directly output it to Redshift. You have to output it to S3 and then go basically import the data into Redshift. Or it could be going on to Elasticsearch cluster, etc. So the key thing to remember, the difference between Kinesis Firehose and Kinesis Streams. Kinesis Streams has shards and your data has persistence. By default, it's stored for 24 hours. So this is all Kinesis Streams is. Whereas Kinesis Firehose, there's no data persistence. You need to do something with that data as soon as it comes into Firehose. Kinesis Analytics works with Kinesis Streams and with Kinesis Firehose, and essentially it can analyze the data on the fly inside either service. And then it goes in and stores this data either on S3, Redshift, or Elasticsearch cluster. So onto my exam tips. Hopefully that made sense, but essentially you just need to know the difference between Kinesis Streams, Kinesis Firehose, and you're going to be given scenario questions where you must choose the most relevant service. So with Kinesis Streams, if you see mentions of shards, or even you just need to understand what a Kinesis is at a high level. So if you see something about using streaming data, think instantly Kinesis. If it then asks you which Kinesis service to use and it's talking about shards, you're going to be using Kinesis Streams. If you need data persistence, so if you need 24 hours or up to 7 days, again, you want to be using Kinesis Streams. If you don't care about data persistence and you want to analyze it on the fly automatically using Lambda, then you're going to be using Kinesis Firehose. And then, of course, if you want to analyze your data inside Kinesis, you can use Kinesis Analytics. And Kinesis Analytics analyzes the data inside both Kinesis Streams and Kinesis Firehose. So that is it for this lecture, everyone. You've done really, really well. I know this was a very theoretical section of the course. A lot of the application services have started to move away from the Solutions Architect exam to the Developer exam. That being said, you still need to understand SQS, SNS, Kinesis, and definitely API Gateway. API Gateway will come up an awful lot in your exam. It's probably worth 5 or 10 marks. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at Web Identity Federation and Amazon's Web Identity Federation service Cognito. It's a very, very short lecture, and then we'll move on to summarize everything we've learned in the application section of the course. So if you've got the time, please join me in the next lecture. Thank you.